Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera. Dan dalam era COVID-19, salam sehat. I wish to thank the organizers for the opportunity to present in this 2021 International Conference on Indonesian Culture. My presentation is within the stream of topic 1, cultural ecosystem. And I will be concentrating on a particular dilemma in festival performance, that between what I call enactment and transaction. Enactment is cultural performance for aesthetic purposes for an audience, for example, an audience of tourists. Transaction is ritual performance to actually make a change in the world, to heal a person or to affect a status change rather than for aesthetic purposes. And we'll see how many aspects of festival performance can be rather ambiguous as to these two. But let me first contextualize festivals with some background on the development of national culture and festivals within that context. So national culture has been a particular imperative for the Indonesian state from the onset of independence, from the 1945 Constitution. But there have been transitions in exactly how national culture was constructed. Sukarno in the old order sought to bring Indonesian culture onto the world stage, to put it up there among the national traditions of the world. Whereas Suharto, during the new order, his regime sought to define Indonesian culture, not against external competitors, but against the internal context of particular regional and ethnic particularities. In order to do this, it came up with a notion of national culture as the assemblage of the high points or puncha of regional cultures throughout the archipelago. But these high points had to fit within particular constraints of cultural representation, had to be consistent with development and thus promote positive values that could facilitate development. It had to avoid the topics of Sara, suku, agama, ras, antar golongan. It had to be consistent with the 5 recognized monotheistic religions: Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, and Catholicism. Confucianism having been dropped from that canon during the new order, but then reinstituted during Reformasi by Gus Dur. Now, Indonesia's attempts to gain recognition in the UNESCO World Heritage List led to various other developments within the construction of national culture. It was first successful with getting various aspects of material culture recognized. For example, Borobudur gaining recognition in 1991. But this came with the transformation of Borobudur into Taman Borobudur, where it became primarily an object of consumption for tourists rather than of religious pilgrimage, which was allowed during 1 day a year. These trends were furthered by the attempts to gain recognition of intangible cultural heritage in Indonesia. Intangible cultural heritage really only comes onto the global scene in 2001 with the UNESCO International Roundtable on Intangible Cultural Heritage, which gave this definition on the slide here for intangible cultural heritage, which is recognized until today. So rather than material culture, intangible cultural heritage concentrates on practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills. But these must also fit within particular criteria, such as consistency with international human rights instruments, fostering positive values such as mutual respect, and being consistent with sustainable development. Now, the other factor that feeds into the development of national and regional cultures is reformasi. You have a greater scope for the recognition of variety with the onset of cultural autonomy. that legislation also sets up certain demands for economic development at the regional level. With pemekaran, the development of new administrative units, you have ever more administrative units, provinsi, kabupaten, and such, that need to find pendapatan asli daerah, or PAD. They have more responsibility for funding their own budget. And this can come from various sectors: plantation development, kelapa sawit, mining, tourism. Tourism is the one that is important for our topic of festivals. Tourism is the object of many initiatives in cultural development at the regional level, including the efflorescence of festivals at provincial and kabupaten level. Another factor is the recognition of Masyarakat Adat, with, in 1999, the formation of Aliansi Masyarakat Adat Nusantara, and its recognition of a number, continuing throughout Reformasi, of komunitas adat, or customary communities. That recognition fosters the ability to put forward one's ethnicity as a fulcrum of identification. And with that, the rise of ethnotainment, of cultural performances based upon the assertion of that ethnicity. Okay, so all these factors drive the efflorescence, the greater number of local level festivals in Reformasi, Indonesia. Now, festivals are very much the processual analog of tangible heritage. They are the enactment with proper government authorization of living heritage. Okay, they require some sort of acknowledgement or ratification and the usual economic sponsorship by the state. Okay, they are a primary means of promoting tourism revenue for kabupaten, provinsi, and such. Okay, so festivals are part of a process of commodification. They bring in not just income, but various sorts of capital. For example, cultural capital, social capital. They build connections, symbolic capital, prestige, and such. But this comes only with the submission to various forms of authorization and legitimation. And this means sometimes it fosters a certain amount of resistance. Some constituencies do not like to see their adat reduced to display. They want to see festivals, for example, as venues for the transmission of authentic adat to the younger generation of their own ethnic groups, rather than primarily for touristic consumption. So I move now to my major case study, the Festival of Lake Lindu. The Festival of Lake Lindu comes about as an initiative of Kabupaten Sigi, which was a new kabupaten, part of Pemekaran, that was formed in 2009. It had various motivations for Pemekaran. Kabupaten Sigi includes a lot of highland kecamatan, and in Sulawesi and other islands of Indonesia, highland cultures are often Christian rather than Muslim in orientation. So having its own kabupaten carved out of what used to be Kabupaten Donggala, which was mainly dominated by lowland kecamatan, was a way that Christian adherents in the highland cultures felt that they might be able to get actual officials elected, the secretary of the kabupaten, maybe down the track, the bupati himself. Kabupaten Sigi was also formed on the basis of conservation as a major priority. A large chunk of Kabupaten Sigi is taken up by Taman Nasional Lore Lindu, which had been gazetted in the 1990s as a national park. And this national park was under a co-management regimen. The government authority, the Nature Conservancy, and local Adat councils. So it was part of the revitalization of customary councils of local Adat to be involved in the management of Taman Nasional Lore Lindu. Now, even before, but later becoming part of Sigi district, was the recognition of Lindu as a separate kecamatan. And in fact, it billed itself as a kecamatan konservasi. I think the first and probably still the only kecamatan konservasi in Indonesia, although there are quite a few kabupaten konservasi. Part of the formation of Kecamatan Konservasi Lindu involved the codification of Adat, writing it down and transforming it into primarily a community-based natural resource management system. Now, being right in the middle of the national park and having at its core Lake Lindu, it was seen as the primary natural attraction of the new kabupaten. So one of the first initiatives of the new kabupaten was to set up a festival of Lake Lindu. It was a kabupaten initiative and would have representatives taking part from all of the kecamatan of the new kabupaten. Now, as a festival, it followed the sort of program that is quite common for festivals throughout Indonesia. The spine of it is a number of performances or presentations, penampilan, in this case, representing by various groups from the kecamatan, various competitions, boat racing, tug of war, and such, and a beauty pageant to see the representative of which kecamatan who would be crowned as Putri Danau Lindu. Okay. The first festival, perhaps what people most remembered about that was that within the framework of Adat, there was an incident of the Bupati of Sigi being fined by the governor. He got up before the governor had finished eating. And this was considered an example of talawampa, failing to wait until the Raja finished eating. Nobody is allowed to finish eating and move to another activity until the Raja has finished. And in this case, the Raja is interpreted as the governor. This was a case of nojampa, of tidak menghormati adat. Okay, and the governor, with the endorsement of the local Adat Council, fined the Bupati according to the Sampole. Now, the Sampole requires slaughtering a water buffalo. Okay, and this was to be done at the second festival. The second festival, 2010, its motto, where custom meets conservation, kind of set up the whole orientation of the kabupaten. Once again, the governor on the first afternoon was the primary actor within it. And he arrived in the early afternoon, changed into pakaian adat, and then entered the festival area that had been erected the previous year, a stage with a concreted area surrounded by over a dozen koteks or cottages. And once he went through the gauntlet of the contestants for Putri Danau Lindu, then began all the sambutan. And the governor gained the greatest applause by saying that the festival Danau Lindu would in subsequent years be raised to the level of a festival provinsi rather than of just a kabupaten. Then came the what was to be the adat payment of the fine. Okay, but first off, it had to be shortened from the demands of the protocol officers of the governor's entourage because of the time constraints. Okay, this began to produce a certain amount of disquiet among the Adat elders who were beginning to feel that this was not a transaction, a real fining, but an enactment, an aesthetic spectacle based upon Adat. This was further this feeling was further enhanced when a water buffalo was slaughtered by a person, a local Lindu person, whose shoulder was held by the governor, so in the name of the governor. But then the corpse was just taken aside, and its meat was not used as the basis of the meal at the end of that afternoon. And that means that without the meat of the sacrificed water buffalo being used, it's not really Shah. It's not valid. Again, a disquiet that this was an enactment, not a real adat transaction. Okay. As I said, the spine of such festivals are the presentations. Okay, and these could be categorized into 5 different categories. There were the rituals of masyarakat adat, aesthetic performances of, for example, wedding negotiations. There were the oral literature performances, which included dramas, although the dramas were also often centered upon various rituals. Thirdly, there were the regional songs, the lagu daerah. These usually had quite modern lyrics, and some of them were based actually upon, for the highland kecamatan, church hymns. There was musik bambu, a traditional instrument that had a categorization of its own. This is very much considered Highland tradition, but one must acknowledge that it is a missionary-inspired sort of performance that began in Sangir Talaut and then was imported to Central Sulawesi. And finally, there were the created dances, the tarian kreasi. These were choreographed, often by lowland academics, and tended to be more generically Indonesian in costume and movement, rather than particularly keyed to local cultures of Central Sulawesi. The first 3 performances held on that afternoon, while the governor was still present, were one of the oral literature dramas from Sigi Biromaru, where the capital of the of the kabupaten is located. Then there was a performance of a Mobalia Jinja, a curing ceremony that is based upon invocation of local spirits and spirit possession. And then there was the performance of another local ritual, the Arat Sintiu Keramat, a performance of offerings to bountiful harvest, for a bountiful harvest. Now, these were meant as aesthetic performances, not actual rituals. But the Mobalia crossed the boundary, because the 2 female dancers were not just dancing. At one point, they became possessed. Okay. Now, they had to stop this performance. The 2 dancers had to be brought to the local puskesmas. They were obviously in a bad state. One of them didn't come out of possession until actually the next morning. This shocked especially many of the lowland participants. And to have actual possession was seen as something that was idolatrous, berhala. Some of the local elders felt that it only demonstrated the power of the Lindu spirit world. They said, spirits do not recognize the difference between actual ritual and performances, so of course they're going to come. Okay, so the boundary of aesthetic enactment had been transgressed. What we had gotten with spirit possession was a ritual transaction with the spirit world. Okay, now the register moved then with very much moving back to the enactment governmental frame. We had the communal meal served to honored guests in Adat fashion, seated on the stage. But again, it didn't include the sacrificial water buffalo. The governor then moved to inaugurate the 15 cottages surrounding the festival performance area. went down to the lake and inaugurated a boat for lake surveillance that had been paid for by the government, planted a tree as a display of conservation, and inspected various stalls. Okay. He then left, and after a period of rest, there was the evening presentations. I won't go through these in great detail. There was a bamboo band, a regional songs competition, an adat pemoa, the adat for setting up a marriage, which included a rego dance, and the first of the presentations of the contestants for Putri Danau Lindu, a lagu daerah, and a tarian kreasi. The tarian kreasi was actually performed by Tadulako University students, but it was billed as the contribution of the host Lindu people. The puncha of the whole festival was obviously the Lake Lindu Beauty Pageant, which occurred over the 3 nights. I've mentioned the introduction of the contestants in customary attire. The second night, they appeared in national costume, kabaya and kain, and in quite modest evening gowns on the third evening. They also were going to have a fashion shoot on Tobola, on Bola Island in the middle of the lake, but Adat elders intervened and said, you cannot just go straight there. You must have an elder to accompany you to protect you from the spirit of the island. Otherwise, the boat may be capsized. So again, a movement between enactment and transaction. Okay. The festival ended badly when the name of the wrong contestant was brought to the MC and declared the winner. And the jury protested, and another contestant, actually the contestant from Lindu, Kecamatan, was then given the crown. This provoked a near riot from the people who had come from Kecamatan Dolo Selatan, from that of the first winner. And we had to have the intervention of local police and such. Things were calmed down, and they did have an all-night daro to end it. But it cast a shadow on the subsequent performance for the next year. Now, I want to talk a bit about the committee's workshop. There was, during one of the afternoons, a discussion that was hosted by the festival manager. And it concentrated on some of these dilemmas of enactment and tradition. The festival manager believed that festivals were an occasion to dig up tradition so that it can be spectated, to extract the aesthetic core and leave the sacral elements behind. I mean, this reminds me very much of Goetz's hermeneutic method in anthropology, that you can extract the text of culture from people's intentions in rituals and from the contextual effects of a ritual. One participant in the discussion said that a festival has to be like a cubist painting. You rearrange all the elements into an aesthetic design that is very different from actual ritual performance. Okay. This whole discussion spawned some quite heated reactions. For example, one lowland participant rejected many of the performances that had gone on as being perhala, especially the Mobalia spirit possession, that these had no place in a festival, whereas others felt that you had to really represent the energy of local adat, and that you should have these, but reframed as heritage rather than ritual transaction. And the discussion was it really didn't have a summing up, leaving us with the problem of, how could festival performance be a commodified performance that also retained not only the aesthetic elements, but the energized elements of local adat. Okay, so let me conclude. despite some of the opening up of ritual performance, recognition of adat in regional autonomy, you still have the continuity of many of the constraints that one found in New Order festivals and such. The governmental framing of the occasion, the particular parameters that are set up by Dinas Pariwisata and such. It is, after all, a festival. It is meant to be primarily an occasion of aesthetic display, and it is meant to be a source of regional income, which involves thus a certain amount of commodification in order to attract tourism revenue. Okay, but despite all those, there still is this tension between exhibition and performance, between enactment and transaction. Performances of aestheticized culture can sometimes break out into actual ritual transactions with the spirit world in terms of possession in the Mobalia performance, for example. So that festivals, especially in the Reformasi area and beyond, have moved from being an orderly modernist display of regional variations to a much more postmodern accommodation of multiple frames, mixing regional, national, and global idioms, and mixing both enactment and transaction. And let me conclude by relating this to the festival of Palu, Palu Nomoni, Palu Resounds, that was enacted in 2018. Now, this was to include an enactment of the 10 stages of Mobalia. But the Wali Kota, the mayor of Palu, was very, very adamant that this was only a ceremonial spectacle, a tontonan ceremonial, a celebration of local heritage, rather than an actual transacted ritual. But the night of the opening, just before it was to formally open, before the governor and mayor had arrived, there occurred the earthquake, followed by the tsunami and also the liquefaction that killed tens of thousands of people, between 20 to 30,000 people. Okay. Now, very soon thereafter, in religious media, in pronouncements, many were saying the tsunami and the earthquake, the liquefaction, that disaster came because there was going to be a Mobalia. Okay, that it was Sirik, it was polytheist in orientation, and Palu suffered the consequences. Okay, as a result, the mayor canceled all future Palu Nomoni festivals, and it has not been held since. In fact, with COVID-19, we've had the postponement of all festivals in the region. But the dilemma of interpreting whether the Palu disaster was caused by the inclusion of Mobalia in the Palu Nomoni festival, that just highlights that there remains the continuing problem in festival performance of distinguishing heritage enactment and ritual transaction. So many thanks for listening. Tarima kasih nadea in the Kaili language. And I hope that this can catalyze some questions from all of you.